So last lesson we looked at different measurement tools we use to measure physical activity behaviour. What we're going to look at in this lesson is how we actually go about changing physical activity behaviour in both individuals and also at a population level. So the main basis of this lesson, and this is chapter 2 in your textbook, is the social ecological model, which is the accepted model that we talk about in VCE PE about how we go about getting behaviour change. It's pretty heavily examined. You'll probably find anywhere from 6 to 8 marks on the VCAR exams of the last few years on this, and it's typically not very well answered by students either. So we definitely want to make a really big effort to get a mastery of applying the social ecological model so we can pick up those marks. So how do we change physical activity behaviour? In a broad sense, what we're doing is we're implementing specific physical activity initiatives. So programs that aim to get people more active. And what our initiatives do is they target what we call mediators. And mediators are the things that would, well, I suppose, stop a person from being active, or all the things that would make a person be more active. So the examples here: self-efficacy, your skill level, social support. They're all things that if you're lacking them, you're going to be less likely to participate in physical activity. So if we can improve those mediators, we're going to have a better chance of getting the individual or the individuals in a broader population setting being more active. When we create an initiative, what we're doing is we're targeting 4 levels, and this is what the social ecological model does. So it's saying for initiatives to be most effective, we need to target change in the individual. We need to target mediators that are social mediators. We need to also target mediators in the physical environment, and we also need to target mediators within policy. And if we can have an initiative that targets and addresses the mediators in those 4 levels, then that intervention program is going to have a higher chance of success. And when we unpack the social ecological model, we'll look at exactly what makes up these 4 levels: individual, social, physical environment, and policy. We'll have a look at exactly what makes those up. This slide here is not so much something you would need to memorise, but it's just sort of outlining how you would go about implementing an initiative and evaluating its success. And we've talked about this before. So in any initiative, you want to take some baseline data. You want to address what the change mediators are. So what are the things we need to target and get improvement in to get these people more active? And then I suppose you're working backwards a little bit. Once you know what your mediators are, you're going to design specific intervention programs that directly target those mediators. And then finally, you're going to take some post-intervention measures to see what sort of behaviour change has occurred. So you're getting baseline data, pre-testing, identifying your mediators, implementing specific initiatives to improve the mediators, and then you're doing some post-testing to see how effective it's been. Before we go and unpack some complex examples of physical activity initiatives and apply our social ecological model, we'll just have a quick chat about the 2 main categories of physical activity promotion. So we can target individuals or we can target populations. When we're targeting individuals, to date, typically these intervention programs do target the behaviour of the individual. So they're really trying to bring about more psychological change in terms of their cognitive behaviours and the way they perceive and value physical activity. What they do have is some limitations by just focusing on those psychological factors, often social and physical factors that also impact on a person being physically active are overlooked, and then therefore those programs would be less effective than one that does include those aspects. If you're targeting individual behaviour change, in terms of the strategies you're going to use, it's a lot of one-on-one, so a lot of face-to-face interactions. Counselling would be something that's heavily used, as well as trying to reach the people through online information and also print-based media. If we're looking at targeting larger populations to improve their physical activity behaviour, so we're moving beyond the individual and we're looking at getting larger groups involved. And typically when we're targeting populations, we're going to try and use a settings-based approach. And a settings-based approach means that you're going to target your initiative to a particular setting. So that could often be a school setting, it might be a work setting, it might be targeting a family, or you could be targeting a particular community. And that intervention would be designed with that specific setting in mind, so that hopefully it's as effective as it could be. With populations, obviously compared to an individual, the face-to-face and counselling type strategies are not going to be as effective because it's just not practical to administer that type of intervention with large groups. So when we're looking at population level strategies, we're often looking at environmental change, so changes in the demographic factors that are impacting on those individuals in the population. We're also looking at policy, and that's probably a good one for workplaces as well, where we're looking at changes in rules and regulations to try and get people to become more active. And in terms of reaching large groups, we're using mass media to sort of as our medium to get as much contact with those people in the group as possible. So where are we now and where have we come from in terms of the models we use? So as I've said a few times already, our current model that we use for physical activity behaviour change is the social ecological model, though it hasn't always been the preferred model. For a long time, much like our individual approaches, models have just focused on psychosocial models. We're looking at targeting change in the social behaviours of a person and also in their thinking, I suppose, to try and influence their physical activity. As I said before, in recent times we have shifted to the social ecological model, and that is our preferred model at the moment, and that's because that model, it acknowledges that physical activity behaviour is a really complex thing. It's hard to change and therefore it's influenced by many things. So the social ecological model really identifies the importance of those 4 different levels: the individual, the social environment, the physical environment, and the policy, and values them all as having a big impact on behaviour change. So down the bottom here, as I said, basically you need to never ever forget that physical activity behaviour change is complex. To have successful interventions that change behaviour, you need to address all components of the social ecological model. And that is the value of an intervention. An intervention that targets more of those levels or all of those levels is always far more effective than an intervention that targets less. So we'll move more directly into the actual social ecological model now. And from here on in this lesson, this is definitely the stuff you really want to get your head around and really want to have a good understanding of, because this is the thing that's examined relatively heavily in your exam. So as I said earlier, you could be looking at anywhere from 6 to 8 marks of your exam made up from questions about the social ecological model. And typically what they're getting you to do is they might be giving you a scenario or a bit of a context. Might be a school setting or a workplace setting where a particular intervention strategy is being implemented. And then they might ask, from the information given, which level of the social ecological model is being targeted with this particular intervention. Or it might say, apply the social ecological model to critique how effective this intervention program would be. And then you would need to look at the details of the intervention program and pretty much identify which levels of the social ecological model are being included in the intervention. Or it might even be a question that just follows on from a scenario and says such and such is a individual, is an intervention targeting the individual level of the social ecological model. Suggest 2 intervention strategies that could be used to target the social environment of this initiative, or the physical environment, or the policy. So they're the things that generally you would need to do. So with our model, as we said before, you've got your 4 levels. You've got level 1, which we call the individual level. And basically it's in the middle because it is saying individual behaviour is still at the core of physical activity behaviour. However, what this model is also saying is that, well, this individual behaviour, which is your beliefs, your knowledge, your skills, your attitude, well, it can be impacted on by the outer 3 layers. It can be impacted on by the social environment, the physical environment, and also the political environment, or the policies. So all of the outer layers impact on that individual layer on the middle, but with each layer, it's also influenced by each subsequent layer and also by each previous layer. So the social environment is influenced by the individual. The social environment is also influenced by the physical environment. The physical environment is influenced by the social environment, and the physical environment is also influenced by the political environment. So there's this complex interrelationship between all 4 of the levels. The individual level of the social ecological model is also sometimes referred to as the intrapersonal level, and that's because it incorporates the things that are specific to each individual. So we're talking about psychological factors of the individual's attitudes, their intentions, their self-efficacy is a big one because that relates to the confidence they have in themselves to go out and be active. The things they like, the things they don't like, their behaviours, what's their knowledge like? Obviously, a person that's more knowledgeable about the benefits of physical activity is more likely to engage in it. Whereas we get some people that have a relatively low knowledge of physical activity and its benefits to health. What's their individual skill level? Somebody is less likely to be involved in physical activity if they don't have the skill set to be able to compete successfully in physical activity. I probably shouldn't say compete, but participate would be a better word, because we all know physical activity is not just sport. What are their habits as well? That could be their dietary habits, it could be their work habits, it could be their interests. What do they like to do? And it also includes some demographic information on them. So how old they are, their gender, what level of education they reached, are they married, what sort of income do they earn? We do find a link between low socioeconomic status, so people with relatively low income, and poorer levels of physical activity, and that's really because they're a bit more restricted in where they live, what they can access. Often that's also linked to a lower level of education as well, so they all impact. In terms of some specific intervention strategies that target the individual level, we've got really anything that is addressing some of those factors we just listed before. So educational programs would be a good initiative to counter the factor of people not having a good knowledge and understanding of physical activity. It would also be a good way to improve a person's skills and limit the effect that having a low skill set would have on a person being physically active. Support groups as well, though I'd probably argue that that one sits a little bit better in our next level, which is our social environment. Counselling would target self-efficacy quite effectively, getting people more confident to go out there and be physically active, and also addressing some of those psychological factors that are impeding them being more active. Organisational incentives such as subsidised gym membership, so that would help address the issue of income and low socioeconomic status. This one as well could also arguably be sitting in the policy level. So you can probably start seeing some of them don't fit perfectly into one, but there can be some overlap of an initiative across two areas. And also mass media. Though mass media is a technique used to target populations, the individuals within that target population would be receiving the message, and that would be helping to encourage them to be more active as well. So probably in a nutshell, intervention strategies at an individual level, you're probably looking at education and upskilling, or directly targeting self-efficacy. The next level of the social ecological model is the social environment level, and that's pretty much acknowledging that even if a person had the individual mindset of wanting to be active, well, there's still social factors that can impact on their behaviour of actually being active. So the social environment level is really looking at the relationships or the social or cultural factors that also play an influence in participation in physical activity. So if you think about it, if you've got a child or a person who has a family setting where they're encouraged to be active, that family, maybe they're active together on weekends, they go to a park, they go for walks, they go for bike rides, or you've got a parent that can drive you to training or can drive you to the park to play, you've got a strong support group. And what we're saying is, if you don't have a strong support group, if you don't have people around you that are supporting and encouraging you to be physically active, well, that is an obstacle to you becoming more active. So this level could include the person's culture, because cultural and social traditions can impact on physical activity behaviours. That also relates to role expectations, which can also be linked to culture as well. What's the expectations of you as a male, as a female? What's the expectations of you at your particular age? How do they impact on individual behaviours? What's the behaviours of the family group, or of the peers you hang out with, or of the people you work with at work? A family with more positive physical activity behaviours, the individuals in that family are probably more likely to be active themselves. What support do people have? Personal support, which is like your primary support, so your families, your friends, your peers, but also professional support as well, doctors, coaches, teachers. And then we have a problem of social isolation. If you're socially isolated, that's also going to impact your ability to be physically active as well. The ultimate goal of a physical activity intervention strategy is definitely to improve physical activity behaviour, but the social environment level is probably more aimed at doing that through interim targets, such as improving the social and cultural influences on that behaviour. So when we look at interventions, in a nutshell, I suppose we're saying anything that increases physical activity participation with the help of peers or family. So if you're reading a scenario given to you in a VCAR exam or a SAC, or even if you're just watching an advertisement on a new physical activity campaign, what you could think to yourself is, does this campaign have an initiative in it or a strategy in it that encourages people to be active with other people, with their family, with their friends? And if the answer is yes, then you can say then that's hitting the social environment level of the social ecological model. So anything that increases activity with the help of peers or family. So that could be in the form of peer programs. It could be community education, because you're educating a community to be active together. It could be support groups. It could be incentives in the workplace that get colleagues to be physically active together. Social marketing campaigns, or campaigns that challenge negative influences on social norms. The next level of the social ecological model is the physical environment level. This level is generally pretty easy to identify because it is just looking at the effect that the actual physical environment does have on a person's ability to be active. So you could be you could have that mindset of wanting to be active. You could have the skills that allow you to be physically active. You might also have some social support, and you might have a family that want to be active with you. However, you're still going to be somewhat limited if you don't have a physical environment that supports that level of activity. So when we're looking at the physical environment, we're breaking it into two sections. We have our natural environment, which has an influence, and that's things like trees, water, beaches, grass, wildlife. It's a bit like aesthetics. A more attractive environment will attract people to that environment to be active. But it's also looking at the built environment. So what sort of access do you have to man-made features that influence physical activity, to sporting ovals, to gyms, to courts, fields, amenities, pools, car parking. So between those two things, the natural environment and the built environment, that's going to have a large impact on how active somebody is. Coming under those two things, we've got some specific examples here. So access to facilities and spaces, health-related efforts of workplaces, for example, the perceived beauty and the safety of the surroundings. Safety is a big one. If you don't feel safe to go out and go for a walk, or to go out and go for a run, or you don't feel safe to go down to the park, maybe you don't feel safe to let your kids go and play, then that's obviously going to make people be less active. Your geographic location, where you actually live, will have an input. If you live in a climate where it's always raining, or on the other side it's always really, really hot, that will definitely influence your ability to get outside and be active. If you live in a highly dense housing area where there's not a lot of free land to go out and use, well, that will affect your activity, as will limited public transport, because that relates to how easy it is for you to get to a facility to use. When we're looking at specific intervention strategies to target the physical environment, once again, it's relatively straightforward. We're definitely looking at improved accessibility to sporting facilities. So making it easier for people to access sporting facilities. Also looking at creating new sporting and recreation facilities themselves that are easy to get to, so close to schools, close to communities, shopping centres. Obviously with the thought there being if there's more opportunities, more facilities to be active and it's easy to get to them, then people should definitely be more active. Addressing some of those safety concerns, so things that calm or ease the traffic, could even be more an improvement in bike lanes, for example, or walking paths, just things that make people feel safer to be active. And then the bottom one there is probably looking at some incentives to attract people to taking the more active transport route, so having background music in stairs, having CCTV in stairs would also make people feel more safe. They might be less inclined to take the lift, get some more incidental exercise. Our final level of the social ecological model is the policy level, sometimes called the organisation and policy level. So this level it's actually one that people get confused with the most, and when you're reading through some of the VCAR exam answers, it's often a policy level answer that trips people up. So what we're looking at really is policies, regulations within an organisation that promote people to be more physically active. And the thing that people get confused with is you can't have a policy that forces people to be more physically active. So you're not going to get an example where an organisation is implementing a policy that says every member must go for a 20-minute run once a day. You just simply cannot force a person to be physically active. What it's about is creating policies and regulations within an organisation that give people the opportunity to be more physically active, or that promote opportunities for people to be more physically active. So the thing with an organisation, so when we talk about organisations, we talk about daycare settings, schools, universities, and any workplaces. And people are generally spending, you can spend a third to half of your day at one of those settings, whether you're a kid at childcare, a young adult at university or at school, or whether you're an adult at work. You are typically spending a third or up to a half of your day in that setting, which could be a third to half of your life being in organisational settings. So it's a bit of a catch-22. Because you're there for so long, if those organisations can get it right, well, you're going to get exposed to a lot of physical activity, and that's going to be a good thing. However, the catch-22 is, if those organisations are getting it wrong and they don't have policies in place that promote physical activity, well, you're spending a lot of your time at a place where you can't be as physically active as what you should be. So things we're looking at when we're targeting the policy level, as I said, it's policies, procedures, rules put in place at a workplace. So for example, here you could have a workplace legislation that enforces short physical activity breaks from sedentary work. So you could enforce that people have a 10 or 15 minute break every hour or every 2 hours. What you can't enforce is exactly what they do on that break. So you can't force them to be physically active in the break, but you can certainly implement legislation that they have to get up and move from their desk during that time. Also, putting green spaces in environments, putting facilities in workplaces that give people a chance to be active. You could have an active transport policy. This would be a good one at schools, having lockers and things like that for their bikes to help that happen. Definitely you could have compulsory, and we do have compulsory physical education lessons at schools. We have a certain amount of hours where people need to be active. We have our National Physical Activity Guidelines. That should actually say Australian Physical Activity Guidelines, since we look at that now instead of the national ones. I can't write Australia like this, so we'll go with Oz. School rules, for example, no skateboarding or scooters to school. That would force people to, well, not force them, but it would mean that their transport to school would be one of walking. We could also have things such as gym subsidies, subsidised gym membership for employees. You could have a monetary bonus, so employees that are signed up to a gym and use it frequently, or a personal trainer, they might get a monetary bonus in their salary. Extended lunch breaks would be another policy to give people more opportunity to be active. Organisations could make links with other health-related organisations and therefore create discounted memberships for those employees to things like gyms, golf courses, etc. In summary, on our social ecological model, and the model itself is not hard to understand, what we need to do is practice applying it. It's a multidimensional model, individual, social, physical and policy levels. For intervention programs to have the most success, well, the more levels they address, the more successful they will be. So they really need to address 2, 3 or all 4 of the levels to be really effective. Addressing just one, that intervention is not going to be very effective at all. There's a reciprocal relationship between the individual level and the outer levels, so they influence each other, and each individual layer influences one another as well. Finally, and this will move us on to our next slide, intervention programs need to target specific settings, so a settings-based approach. When we're designing intervention strategies, Yes, we want to make sure we address all 4 levels of the SEM, the social ecological model, but we also want to tailor that intervention to the specific setting we're trying to improve behaviour in, whether it be a school, a workplace, or a community. So when we're looking at tailoring social ecological models to target a specific setting, we're really saying that the model or the initiative needs to be targeted towards the attitudes and behaviours of the population. Different population groups can definitely have similarities in different components across the levels, but you still need to target that initiative to that specific setting. And as I said before, our 3 main settings are: we target initiatives to schools, to communities, or to workplaces. Finally, just a nice summary slide here of the model. So we've got our individual factors, the demographics, biological, cognitive, behavioural factors affecting an individual, our social environment factors, supportive behaviours creating a good social climate and culture, physical environment factors, the natural environment such as the weather and the geography of where somebody's located, also the man-made or constructed environment, which is access to facilities, recreation areas, transport, etc. And then our policy and organisational factors, looking at the policies governing particular incentives, policies also governing the resources and infrastructure related to being physically active or inactive in a particular workplace.